Hi, how are we doing, everybody? I'm Peter Novinski. I'm a senior in the video game development major, minoring in animation and management. And today I'm here to talk to you about tournaments for women and marginalized gender players in professional esports and the need for them in college leagues. So I'm going to start with just some basic definitions here in case you're not super familiar with esports. The definition, according to Merriam-Webster, is a multiplayer video game used as the basis for an organized competition. If there's a part of that that's a little bit complicated to understand, it's the multiplayer aspect, which in the modern era is normally done online, but could also be done through LAN or two people on one keyboard, for instance. But to help you visualize what multiplayer means, think back to Pong. So this is two players, super, super easy. All you got to do is one person moves a paddle up and down to bounce the ball back, and you lose a point if the person gets it past you, right? This is actually very similar in premise to a modern esports competitive game called Rocket League, in which you drive a car around to hit a soccer ball into a net. So you'll have some people trying not to let it into the net and some people trying to get it into the other one. And that looks like this. And so a whole lot more going on here than Pong. But at the end of the day, it's a multiplayer game. You've got two people with different objectives or even more, and that's how the system works. Let's talk a little bit about the history of esports. Depending on what you want to define, you can go all the way back to the 70s. So this was a competition going on at Stanford in '72. About 1 decade after the first video game was made, Space War. It was a Space War competition. Space War was developed at MIT and then distributed to a bunch of colleges essentially for free. And it was just for a bunch of Ivy Leagues to play with. They had these cool computers with built-in screens, and so it was really, really exciting. And about a decade after it came out, we have our first competitive Space War competition. As we move forward in history, we get into the 80s, and game developer companies start running their own tournaments. This is a game called Track and Field. It's a personal favorite of mine, but it's also relevant because it holds the record for most participants in a video game tournament to this day, with over 1 million in just the US. You could participate at any of a specific brand of convenience store or arcade place, and so people from all over the country came out, registered, recorded their high score, and eventually the winners went off to Japan. And we won because we had sneaky strategies involving spitting on the controller. As we get into the 90s, you get online games. At the beginning, it's a lot of LAN stuff, so one computer connecting to another over a local connection, but eventually you'd be able to play with somebody who was in a different house. Doom, about a year after it came out, added a thing called Deathmatch, where instead of playing against enemies, you could play against another player. And eventually you could do that online, and that's the foundation of most first-person shooter esports. And finally, in the 2000s, we get into the rise of internet cafes. As broadband internet gets more popular, but especially in Korea, where you could go to a place, rent out a really, really nice computer with a really, really nice internet, you could play anything that you wanted. And so games like StarCraft became uber popular, and that's when they start getting broadcast on TV. You get tournaments with higher prize rewards, those sorts of things. And then in 2014, we have our very first collegiate esports team at Robert Morris University. And that is actually what their current esports room looks like. It's actually not far from one of these internet cafes that you'd see in Korea. And over the years, so that was in 2014, you can see 2018, 2019, and 2020, just absolute insane growth. That's we're now to over 600 schools are playing, but you can see how quickly it gained traction, especially going into 2020. And here's the St. Edward's team, who, fun fact, have our only national championship in any St. Edward's sports. We have one blue banner hanging in the gym, and it's for Call of Duty. All right, so let's talk about the problem. I'm here to talk about gender equity in esports, and so now that we have an understanding of what esports are and what its history is, we can talk about it. Right now, men represent 88.5% of scholarship funds for esports teams. That's rough. They also represent 90.4% of roster spots annually. Tough. Why is that? There's a lot of really, really bad answers to this question. And we're going to run through and dispute a couple of them. First, women don't play games. Frankly, just entirely untrue. It's been since, when is that, like 2010, when they were below 40%. It's been about 40-60 or 55-45 for a long time. Another argument is women don't play those games. There's this idea that esports, because they're competitive and often violent, that women don't want to play those. That's not true. Among games that are considered esport games, 35% of them are women. So we should have at least 3 times as many of those roster spots as we do. This is the really lame one. And we haven't seen this popularly in a long time, but it still gets thrown around. A lot of blah blah hunter-gatherer, blah blah. Men have this reaction time or something. Totally bunk. And these 3 divas here are some of the best research countering that. They talked about what is the difference between men and women's ability to explore digital spaces. And they determined that the biggest difference was spatial ability, being able to navigate in a 3D space. But they also determined that facilitating spatially related computer experience through spatial training leads to increase in spatial ability for both genders. What that means is if someone is better at you than at spatial ability, you can just practice. And so the difference isn't one of biology, but one of experience. So again, why? We've got a bunch of reasons that aren't true. First of all, marketing. Games are overwhelmingly marketed to boys, and especially at a young age, they're normally hyper-masculine. Many of them are hyper-violent, and so girls don't get the same encouragement to get into games early, which means it's easier for them to convince themselves they're just not good at video games when they try later in life, because their male peers have probably been playing for a lot longer. This is some really interesting research looking at video game reviews and how often men or women come up. When you can see that the amount of times men are mentioned is significantly higher than the women. The amount of time men are pictured, if there's like photos of characters, significantly more. When they talk about a main character, if they do, it'll almost always be a male main character. And then second place is a game where it has a man and a woman main character, and third is a woman main character. So who can do something about this, and what can be done? The NCAA is the foundation of gender equity in collegiate sports. They have an absolute monopoly on college sports in the US, and so they get to set the standards. These are some of the guarantees that you get through the NCAA. Equitable opportunity for all of those. Women in esports are not afforded any of those guarantees because the NCAA has washed its hands of esports. Now, your next thought might be that most of those things the NCAA is saying are actually just applications of Title IX guarantees. Unfortunately, Title IX doesn't apply to video games either. In a really, really complicated court case, they basically decided that esports can't qualify as a sport and thus can't get the same guarantees that other sports do, which means with no legal authority on gender equity in esports and no organizational authority on gender equity in esports, we're left in this period where we have worse gender equity problems than sports have had since Title IX was established in the 70s. So who can do something about this, if not the NCAA or the law? The individual collegiate esports leagues. There isn't one overarching one like there is for traditional sports. There are many. These are the 4 big ones. We here have worked with both the NAC Esports, and the NECC up there. I think we're currently with the NECC for scheduling reasons. They had better days of the week for games. So as you can see, Each one has their own pricing platform, but the way it works is that they generate their profit through membership dues. You put up a certain amount of money to be able to play, and they oftentimes have many different tiers for whether or not, for levels of competitiveness, right? Essentially, do you have a JV team? Do you have a Division I team? Those sorts of things. And so let's talk about the invention of the Women and Marginalized Gender Player Tournament. It all starts with a Reddit post on r/Hearthstone in 2014. 2014, Blizzard gamers, not a really good spot to be in, especially for gender equity. However, the response here is crazy. So somebody posts, "A friend just linked me this, and you must be kidding me," with this image. They've highlighted the participation is open only to Finnish male players. For this particular Hearthstone tournament, only men were allowed to participate. In fact, it wasn't just about Hearthstone. They had different games for each gender. So not only was it that you would have men's Dota and women's Dota. Women couldn't play Dota. It's not a girl game, which is crazy, and everybody realized that even back in 2014. And so within 48 hours, the outcry was so large that the IESF said that they were working on it, and eventually released what is essentially the standard today for women and marginalized gender tournaments, that there is a open for all tournament, anybody who can qualify can play, and then also women's only tournaments, so that we're not taking seats away from women in an effort to be more co-ed, right? It's the same as women's sports in like traditional sports, right? At a significant disadvantage, it's helpful for them to have their own league. Let's also talk money. I can't, at this point in history, talk all about DEI. We have to have some actual money to back it up. This is an interesting chart. I'm not gonna make you read any of this, but essentially I went through esports tournaments, and for each game I looked at a mainstream made for all tournament, and then the viewers for their women and marginalized gender tournament. Because this is standard across professional esports, and collegiate esports just don't have it. And so what I was able to find was, so this is a Chinese game called Mobile Legends Bang Bang. Mobile Legends Bang Bang got about 6% as many viewers for its women and marginalized genders tournament as the men's one. And you might be thinking, that sounds like a horrible loss, but remember, this is based on, if we were to apply this to collegiate esports, it's membership dues. So it's already paid for, so that's just a 6.38% increase in viewership, right? Since it's already paid for. Fortnite, we got up to 7.11. CSGO has an average of 8.55, but maxed out once with over a quarter. And Valorant, which has some of the closest to 50-50 games play for men and women, has gotten from 15.89 to 22.77 to 32.9. So with investing more into the women and marginalized gender tournaments, advertising, marketing, those sorts of things, they're getting up to a third as many views as their main tournament. So conclusions. The official recommendation of this program evaluation is for collegiate esports leagues to adopt the professional league system for women and marginalized gender player tournaments. It's just that simple. And that's my talk. Sure.
Okay, questions for Peter?
Yes.
So I'm not real familiar with these games, but my sense is that, well, I'm wondering if we have female characters in games, my sense is that they're often portrayed in, revealing costumes and a lot of TNA elements, the portrayal of females. And I wonder if there's anything to that might affect whether women actually want to manipulate these characters. I know a lot of women who play D&D, and of course you can create your own character there and look at the character and the features they have. So I wonder if that plays any role in this too.
Definitely. There's a lot of statistics about how women players are more drawn to customizability. Games like Sims is very popular. The problem with the the history of video games, that it's so closely tied to things like comic culture and those sorts of things, where because the market is young boys, they're not concerned with giving their female characters like appropriate, shall we say, depth. It's gotten so much better. One of the first things that people jump to is Lara Croft from the original Tomb Raider, who looked a certain way. But if you look even as early as like the 2013 Tomb Raiders, she's gotten so much more reasonable and becomes a more fleshed out character who like women players actually relate to and enjoy. And so I think we're getting better, but I think it is more a matter of trying too hard to appeal to boys than not trying hard enough to appeal to girls.
Other questions?
Sure thing, yeah.
This is kind of a language question too. It's curious how the word games and the word sports can be used interchangeably in some ways, and I just, when you use both of those terms here, I wonder if the idea that it's a sport is because so many colleges have developed teams for this.
Sure thing.
Other teams we have too, so that's a sport, but if it's not a college team, when you refer to it as a game, I don't know if that would make a difference.
Yeah, and an interesting thing also is thinking about sports that aren't games. For instance, hurdle, definitely a sport, not really a game, right? And so there's really interesting ways back and forth. Essentially, the way that I like to think of a game is interacting with a rule, interacting with a system that has been made before you. And so as long as if you have a rule book, you have a game, basically.
I'm interested in the whole cart and horse aspect of the culture, marketing toward the boys versus marketing toward the girls. It's interesting that you've got the data to back it up. That if they have the women marginalized, they get these percentage jumps, and there's money for that. From what I've heard from people was when they get on headset, sometimes the girls are reluctant to engage, and wondering if there's some hope in that area.
Sure thing. Two main aspects to that. One is anonymity makes people bold. Guys don't mind being more slimy and gross if they're behind a username and don't have a camera and those sorts of things. And so they're more likely to get a little gross, sort of like a comment section, because you have that anonymity. And the other part was, I totally forgot. So,
In esports, there's no
this is true. In actual esports, you're actually on a team. But when it comes to like if you're playing by yourself, there's that problem. The other thing was, it comes back to stigmas about girls being bad at games. So there's two parts of harassment that happen to girl gamers when they get on the mic. One is like flirtatious nastiness, and the other is, oh my God, we have a girl on the team, dude, we're gonna lose, right? And so those both really suck. One of which, if you're a girl, you might be motivated to become like the best in the game to prove them wrong, right? And you could theoretically do something about that. There's not a lot you can do about people making kissy noises in the mic. And so that's something that has to shift more culturally rather than like something we can actually put something in place for. Yes?
It actually seems like adding in, women and marginalized gender players would actually help with that, because if you are under the guidance of this is a college esport team, we have, there's a certain level of behavior that's expected, right? And people get used to watching or seeing or playing, but that then becomes, especially among the really good players, the norm, that actually has potential to improve that.
Yeah, and oftentimes something that helps me when conceptualizing this is thinking about traditional sports. If we had only one basketball league, right, that both men and women played on, you can imagine a guy going like, oh, dude, we have a girl on the team, she's never gonna put up the same points. It's like, that's just an unfair expectation. In sports, it's a biological difference, and here it's a cultural difference that hopefully we get over someday. But the truth is that there's a disadvantage there, and expecting there needs to be a place for women and marginalized gender players to be able to play just against their peers in order for it to be equitable. Yes?
So in general, in just game playing, is there a kind of code of ethics or agreed upon ethical behavior among players?
Well, I sure wish there was. Not really. You know, within certain game cultures, there'll be things like, oh, if you're like about to fight with somebody and he starts doing like a strange move or whatever, you're like, oh, we're gonna fight with knives instead of with guns, and it's a gentleman's agreement that we're gonna do that because he did the funny thing where he shows his knife, you know? And so there are, within individual games, you get sort of subcultures like that, but as far as a code of ethics goes, unfortunately, it's the Wild West. Especially outside of esports, when it is anonymous, it's tough. Within esports, you know, you're on camera and you're on your school's team. You're not going to be at the same level of nasty. But yeah, it's difficult, especially when people can hide behind anonymity. Thank you all very much for listening.
Present the skull.
These stand right there.